History remembers the Manticore as a man-eating monster prowling the farthest edges of the known world. But what if the real terror was never the beast at all? What if the true fear was the distance itself? The vast, unmeasured space between a traveler and the land he left behind, where anything could be true and nothing could be disproven. Now let that thought settle for a moment. Let your shoulders fall, just slightly, away from your ears. There is nowhere else you need to be. If it feels right, let your eyes close now, or leave them open. Either way, you are already where you need to be. Picture, if you like, a dry wind moving across a red plateau. Somewhere ahead, beyond the last cairn and the last known waterhole, a shape waits in the heat shimmer. It has been waiting a very long time. Not hunting, just waiting, as if it knows that all maps eventually run out. This story holds no hero, no curse, and no divine punishment. It holds something quieter, the memory of a creature that lived only in the gap between what we knew and what we feared. And that vanished the moment we finally crossed over. If this channel feels like a place where old stories can breathe, you are welcome to stay. Subscribe only if you wish. The stories will be here regardless, so let the path carry you back. Back before the Persian court received its strange gift. Back before the hunters sharpened their stones. Back to a time when the Manticore was not a myth, but a fact, waiting at the edge of the world for someone brave enough to look. Chapter 1. The Birth of a Shadow. The chamber was small, and the lamplight made it smaller. A single bronze oil lamp burned on a low cedar table, its flame steady in the still air, drawing the room's few shadows close against the walls. The physician had been in Persia long enough to know that the empire never truly slept. Somewhere beyond these mud-brick walls, riders carried dispatches across mountain passes, and caravans moved through cold desert nights. But here, in this quiet room, the world felt suspended in warm amber, waiting for a sound. His name was Ctesias, a Greek from Cnidus who had learned to listen before he learned to speak Persian. He held a wax tablet on his knee, its wooden frame worn smooth by years of use, the beeswax surface cloudy with old erasures. The stylus rested loosely in his fingers, bronze catching lamplight, as patient as a hunting bird waiting for the hand to move. He was not a soldier or a governor. He was a gatherer of things that people said at the edges of firelight, when their voices dropped and their words came slower. The traveler had arrived at dusk, dust still caked in the folds of his cloak, his eyes carrying that particular distance that Ctesias had learned to recognize. He had come from the east, beyond the mountains, beyond the satrapies, beyond the neat lines that the royal cartographers drew on their maps. He spoke no Greek, and his Persian was rough, shaped by dialects that had no names. But his hands told stories his mouth could not yet shape, and Ctesias watched them as closely as he watched the man's face. A servant had brought water, then wine, then a plate of dried figs that sat untouched on the table between them. The traveler drank slowly, his throat working, as if the memory of thirst was still lodged there. Outside the chamber, the palace settled into its own quiet rhythms. The distant murmur of guards changing posts, the cry of a night bird from the gardens, the faint rattle of a loose shutter in the wind. The empire breathed around them, vast and indifferent, while two men sat together in a pool of light. Ctesias did not press. He had learned long ago that the best testimony came when the witness forgot he was being recorded. He asked about the road, about the weather in the passes, about the price of grain in the eastern markets. The traveler answered in fragments, his voice still hoarse from days of silence, and gradually, the tension in his shoulders began to ease. The lamplight softened the lines around his mouth. He was perhaps 40, Ctesias guessed, but he looked older. Traveling the eastern provinces aged a man quickly. Then the traveler stopped speaking mid-sentence, his cup halfway to his lips, and stared into the flame. Ctesias waited. The silence stretched, and the physician did not fill it. He had seen this before. The moment when a man decided whether to speak the thing he had seen, or to carry it unspoken for the rest of his life. The flame flickered in a draft that had no source, and the traveler's eyes, dark and dry, shifted from the lamp to the physician's face. He spoke a single word, and Ctesias did not recognize it. It was not Persian, not Median, not any tongue of the empire's heartlands. The traveler repeated it, slower this time, and then began to describe what the word meant, his hands rising to sketch shapes in the air between them. A lion's body, he said, and his palms curved, as if he were holding the mass of something heavy. A human face, and his fingers touched his own cheek. A tail, and his hands swept outward, and then curled, like a scorpion's sting. Ctesias wrote nothing at first. He simply listened, the stylus still in his lap, while the traveler's account poured out in a rush of broken Persian and anxious gesture. The beast lived far to the east, the man said, in a country of red stone and thorn scrub, where the rivers vanished into sand and the sun burned white at noon. It was the color of dried blood, he said, and its voice was not a roar, but a sound like pipes and trumpets played together. A high, sweet, piercing music that carried across the empty plains and reached you long before the body followed. The physician felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the quiet thrill that came when a story was not merely strange, but true. He had interviewed soldiers who exaggerated their wounds, and merchants who inflated their profits, and he knew the texture of a lie. This was not a lie. The traveler was not boasting. He was not trying to impress a Greek physician with tales of Eastern wonders. He was trying, with whatever words he could find, to warn of something that he genuinely believed would kill anyone who wandered too far into the Red Country. Ctesias lifted his stylus. The motion was small, almost ceremonial, and the traveler fell silent as the bronze point touched the wax. There was a finality in that small sound, the quiet scratch of a word being born. The physician wrote carefully, forming the Greek letters with the precision of a man who knew that what he recorded would outlast the room, the palace, and perhaps even the empire. He wrote a single word, and the traveler watched, and the lamp burned on. The traveler watched the stylus move, his eyes tracking each letter as if the word itself might pull the beast out of the darkness behind him. He had carried this story across mountain passes and salt flats, through nights when he slept with his back against a rock and his knife in his hand. And now it was leaving him. He seemed smaller now, emptied of something. Ctesias finished the first word and looked up, and the traveler nodded once, slowly, as if giving permission for what came next. What came next was a flood. The traveler's voice dropped lower, and he described the thing that made the beast truly terrible. Its tail, he said, was not just a scorpion's sting, but a quiver of hollow quills, each one long as a man's forearm, pale as old bone, and barbed at the tip. It could launch them like arrows from a bow, he said, and his hand mimicked the motion, a sudden flat snap of the wrist. The quills regrew. They always regrew. He had never seen it himself, he admitted, but he had met a man who had, a trader from the Indus country, whose brother had been part of a caravan that strayed too far south into the Red Plateau. They had found him, the traveler said, pinned to the ground by a quill through his thigh, still alive, still trying to crawl. The wound was not deep, but the barb held him like a fish on a hook, and his companions could not pull it free. The man had died there, face down in the dust, while the distant music played on. Ctesias asked the question that hung in the air between them. Did anyone survive an encounter? The traveler shook his head slowly, but not in denial in the way a man shakes his head when the truth is complicated. The locals in the villages nearest the plateau, he said, knew the beast's territory. They left offerings at its boundaries, Small clay figures of deer and goats, hoping to satisfy whatever hunger drove it. They did not hunt it. They did not even speak its name aloud after dark. There is no need to picture the plateau too clearly. It is enough to know that it was red, and that the wind never stopped, and that the thorn scrub whispered like dry bones when it moved. Somewhere in that vastness, a creature the color of dried blood waited, and it had never needed to pursue anything that did not wander into its reach. The traveler's voice had grown very quiet now, and the lamp had burned low, and the shadows had crept closer to the table. The physician's stylus moved again, scratching out not just descriptions, but conclusions. This was not a god's punishment, he noted, and not a curse laid on a human soul. There was no divine parentage here, no tragic metamorphosis, no lesson from Olympus or any other heaven. This was a creature of the natural world, however unnatural it seemed, a product of some far ecology that Greek thought had never mapped, obeying laws that made perfect sense in the Red Country and no sense anywhere else. The traveler's hands had finally fallen still in his lap. He had given the story away, and Ctesias watched the relief settle into his features like water sinking into dry earth. The physician did not thank him. He simply set the stylus down for a moment, and the two men sat together in the quiet, and the lamp between them burned with a soft, steady sound that asked nothing of either of them. When the stylus lifted again, it was to write the word that would anchor the entire account. Martichora. Ctesias had heard the traveler pronounce it several times, and he rendered the foreign syllables into Greek letters with the care of a man transcribing something sacred. He was not inventing a monster. He was recording a name, and the weight of that act pressed down on the small chamber like a change in the weather. The word was now in the world, and it could not be unwritten. The night outside had deepened while they talked, and the palace had grown utterly silent. Even the guards seemed to have stilled. The traveler had fallen into a kind of exhausted doze, his chin resting on his chest, his breath slow and even. Ctesias looked at the wax tablet in his hands and saw that he had filled nearly every surface. Tomorrow he would copy it onto papyrus, and the day after that, perhaps, it would begin its own journey westward. He did not yet know what the word would become. He did not know that it would outlast the dynasty, the empire, and the very language in which he wrote it. He only knew that a crack had opened in the world's edge, and something had stepped through. Not the creature itself, not yet, but its shadow, cast across a single syllable, already beginning to grow as it moved from one man's memory into the long dark current of history. Chapter 2. Assembled from red dust. The beast took shape one word at a time, and the first word was red. Not the red of blood, not the red of sunset, but the deep, dry red of iron-rich earth after a year without rain. The lion's body emerged from that color as if the desert itself had risen and learned to walk on four silent paws. It was the size of a full-grown lion, Ctesias wrote, but leaner, its muscles drawn tight against a frame that had never known surplus. Every rib was faintly visible beneath the hide, a body shaped by scarcity. The fur was not the tawny gold of the lions that Greek travelers knew from Libya or Thrace. It was crimson, the color of old garnets, of pomegranate seeds dried in the sun. In the harsh white light of the eastern plateau, it must have seemed to flicker, Aelion later noted, as if the beast were perpetually on fire. Yet, when it lay still among the red sandstone and the thorn scrub, that same color made it vanish. The creature was its own camouflage, a predator painted by the land itself. Then the face. This was the detail that made the Greek naturalists pause, their styluses hovering uncertain above the wax. It was a human face, Ctesias insisted. Not a mask, not a distorted bestial approximation, but a face that might belong to a man. The skin was pale, paler than any Persian or Indian, and the eyes were blue-gray, calm and unnervingly intelligent, set beneath a brow that showed no anger, no hunger, only a still, patient awareness. Aelion added that the ears were human too, small and finely shaped, catching every sound. The mouth, when closed, might have passed for human as well. Thin lips, a firm jaw, but the mouth never quite closed. The lips met imperfectly, and between them gleamed a third row of teeth, visible even in repose. The first 2 rows interlocked like a shark's, needle-sharp and slightly curved backward, while the third stood sentinel behind them, a pale, serrated palisade that promised no bite would ever be gentle. Aristotle, who trusted Ctesias on most things, admitted this detail with something like reluctance, as if nature had overstepped. The tail completed the portrait, and it was the tail that made the Manticore not merely strange, but lethal. From the base of the spine where a lion's tuft would have swung, rose a segmented scorpion's tail, glossy black at the joints, tapering to a curved sting that glistened with venom. But that was only the beginning. Along the tail's length, on either side, sprouted a row of hollow quills, the color of old ivory, each as long as a man's forearm, barbed like a fishing spear. They lay flat when the creature was still, and fanned outward when it was angry. Aelion described what happened next with the precision of a military engineer. The quills could be launched, he wrote, by a convulsive flick of the tail, shot forward, sideways, even behind, at distances that seemed impossible. A single quill could pin a man to the ground. A volley could clear a path through a caravan. And the stings regrew, Ctesias added, as if the beast carried its own armory beneath its skin, replenishing itself in the dry silence of the plateau while the wind erased its tracks. But it was the voice that haunted the accounts most of all. Not a roar. The Manticore did not roar. Its voice, Ctesias recorded with the traveler's words still fresh in his ears, was exactly like the sound of a trumpet and a set of panpipes played together. Aelion confirmed it, adding that the notes were clear, high, and sweet, carrying across the empty plains like a summons. It was beautiful, the traveler had said, and that was the worst part. Nothing that lethal should sound so lovely. There is no need to hear that sound too clearly. It is enough to know that it carried, and that those who heard it did not forget. The music of the Manticore was not a warning and not a threat. It was simply the sound the creature made, as natural as a wolf's howl or a stag's call. And the fact that it was pleasing to human ears was an accident of biology, not an invitation. The beast was not calling to its prey. It was simply alive, and its aliveness made a sound that happened to travel a very long way. No god had made this thing. That was the conclusion Ctesias reached, though he was careful not to state it too boldly. There was no parentage in the myths, no divine punishment, no hero who had been transformed by an angry deity. The Manticore was not a cursed soul or a broken nymph or a guardian set at the gates of something sacred. It was an animal, born of other animals like it, living in a land that had shaped it over centuries into exactly the form that would survive. That was, in its own way, more terrifying than any myth. Aristotle, reading Ctesias years later in Athens, paused over this same absence. The creatures of Greek legend had origins. They came from Typhon and Echidna, from Poseidon's rage, from the endless feuds of Olympus. But the Manticore simply was. It existed, as far as anyone could tell, without a story, without a reason, without any moral to be drawn from its existence. It was a fact, not a fable, and facts are harder to dismiss than stories. The philosopher made a note in the margin and moved on, but the unease lingered. What the Greeks could not explain, they named. Martichora, a foreign syllable pressed into the service of their own language, its Persian roots still clinging to it like dust from the road. It meant man-eater, and the name was a warning in itself. But naming is not understanding. The word sat uneasily in the bestiaries, a placeholder for something that defied every category the philosophers had built. It was not a lion, not a scorpion, not a man. And yet it was all three, folded into a single breathing whole. The composite form disturbed more than a simple monster would have. A serpent or a giant was at least whole, a single clear violation of the natural order. But the Manticore was assembled from pieces that were themselves familiar, and that familiarity was the source of its particular horror. The lion was known. The scorpion was known. The human face was the most known thing of all. Their fusion created not a creature, but a question. What kind of world could produce such a being, and what did that world say about the one who observed it? Later writers tried to smooth the edges. Aelion, always the most lyrical of the naturalists, described the Manticore's blue-gray eyes as calm, almost sad, and speculated briefly, cautiously, that the beast might feel something like loneliness. It was the only one of its kind ever described, he noted. No ancient source mentioned a mate, a pack, a cub, until the hunters found one. The Manticore seemed to exist in singular silence, moving through the red country as if it were the last of something or the first, and the difference between those two states was not always clear. The voice, too, took on a different quality when considered this way. The sound of pipes and trumpets drifting across the plateau might not be a hunting call, but simply a voice. What if it sang because singing was the only answer to the silence of those empty plains? The traveler had called it beautiful. And perhaps it was beautiful in the way that whale song is beautiful, a sound made not for the listener, but for the self, a resonance that filled the vastness because the vastness would otherwise swallow everything, even the memory of sound. But the teeth were real, and the quills were real, and the bodies of those who wandered too far into the red country were real. The Greeks, for all their philosophy, understood that a creature could be both tragic and lethal. Sympathy did not disarm the beast. The Manticore killed because it was its nature to kill. And the fact that it might feel loneliness or sing to the empty sky changed nothing for the man pinned to the dust by an ivory quill. The universe was not required to make moral sense. Ctesias recorded the beast's method with clinical precision. It did not chase, he wrote. It did not need to. Its territory was vast enough that prey came to it, drawn by the same fatal curiosity that had pulled the traveler eastward in the first place. The Manticore waited in the thorn scrub, its crimson body dissolving into the red stone. And when something approached a wild goat, a deer, a man, the tail would rise and the quills would fly. The kill was distant, efficient, almost surgical. Then the beast would walk slowly forward to feed. What remained after was very little. The Manticore ate everything, Ctesias noted. Flesh, bone, even the hair and the clothes of its human victims. Aelion confirmed it, adding that the triple rows of teeth left nothing behind that could be recognized. There were no remains to bury, no tokens to return to grieving families, no evidence that the person had ever existed except the memory that someone had walked east and never returned. The beast consumed not just the body, but the story of the body, erasing its victims from the record. This detail, more than any other, reached across the centuries and settled into the minds of those who read the accounts. The Manticore did not simply kill, it unmade. It left no bones to bleach in the sun, no skull to warn future travelers, no trace that might become a legend of its own. The silence that followed its feeding was absolute, and the wind that swept across the plateau carried no scent of what had happened. The red dust simply covered everything, and the world continued as if nothing had been lost. And yet, Ctesias wrote one more thing, almost as an afterthought, and it was this small note that kept a Manticore from becoming a simple horror. The locals, he reported, had learned to live near the beast. They knew its territory and avoided it. They left offerings of clay animals at the boundary stones, tiny figures shaped by fire and painted with ochre. They did not worship the Manticore, but they acknowledged it, a quiet, formal courtesy extended to something that could destroy them, and chose, most days, not to. The beast was not malice. It was simply presence. A century later, a Roman encyclopedist would copy Ctesias into his own work and add nothing new. Another century, an Aeolian would fill pages with the creature's habits as if it lived just beyond his garden wall. The portrait was complete. The Manticore had a body now, and a voice, and a territory, and a method of killing, and a name that meant man-eater, but carried a weight far heavier than that simple translation. The shadow that had slipped through the crack in the world's edge had taken form, and it was waiting, not yet a terror, not yet a legend, just a fact, patient and red and very far away. Chapter 3. The Circle of Silence. The waterhole changed first. It was not a sudden transformation. No blood in the shallows, no carcass sprawled on the bank, but the animals simply stopped coming at dusk. For generations, the wild goats and the small desert deer had gathered at this same depression in the red sandstone, a hollow where rainwater pooled and the thorn scrub grew thickest. Then one dry season, the tracks along its rim grew sparse, then vanished. The waterhole still held water, but something had claimed it. The herds moved south, carving new paths through the plateau, and the predators that followed them, the lean wolves and the speckled cats, moved with them. A ring of silence settled around the waterhole, widening slowly outward across the dry wadis and the sandstone ridges. The air remained the same, hot and still and heavy with the taste of dust. But the quality of the silence had shifted, as if the land itself had become aware that it was no longer alone at the top of the food chain. The Manticore did not patrol its territory in the manner of a wolf or a lion. It did not mark boundaries with scent or claw marks. It simply existed at the center of a circle, and the circle was absolute. Aeolian recorded that the beast's range extended for several days' walk in every direction, a domain of red earth and cracked stone that no other large predator entered. The boundary was invisible but unforgiving, and animals that strayed across it did not return. The circle was not a defense. It was a certainty. Within that circle, the Manticore lived as a solitary sovereign, needing no pack to hunt and no den to retreat to. It slept in the open, its crimson body pressed flat against the sandstone, the color of its fur rendering it indistinguishable from the rock. When it rose at dusk to drink, its movements were unhurried, almost ceremonial. Aeolian described it, lowering its human face to the water with a strange gentleness, the blue-gray eyes half closed, the terrible mouth barely disturbing the surface. Its hunting was efficient in a way that unsettled the naturalists who recorded it. It did not chase, Ctesias wrote, because it never needed to. Its quills could bring down a running goat at a distance of 100 paces, and the barbs ensured that even a glancing wound was fatal. The prey would stagger on, bleeding, until it collapsed, and the Manticore would follow the trail at a walk. There was no struggle, no drama, no prolonged contest of strength. Only a walk, and a meal, and the silence returning. The quills themselves were a marvel that Pliny would later call unnatural, though he used the word with something closer to admiration. Each quill was hollow, light as a reed, and grew from a follicle deep in the tail's musculature. When spent, a new quill began to form almost immediately, pushing through the skin like a tooth, hardening over the course of a single moon. The beast carried its own replenishing arsenal, and no ancient observer ever recorded finding one with an empty quiver. What it ate, it consumed entirely. This was the detail that lodged deepest in the minds of those who lived near the Red Plateau. The Manticore left no bones, no hooves, no scraps of hide, its triple rows of teeth. Those interlocking backward curving needles ground everything to fragments small enough to swallow. The desert floor around its favored water holes bore no trace of its kills. A gazelle, a goat, a man, all vanished, with the same completeness, as if the world had simply closed over them. The locals, whose names the Greek sources never recorded, had long ago learned to read the signs that the beast left in its wake. A sudden silence among the birds, a flock of vultures circling and then dispersing without landing, as if disappointed. The distant sound, at dawn or dusk, of something that might have been pipes and might have been trumpets, carrying across the still air. And the quills, those pale, translucent shafts that the wind sometimes rolled across the caravan tracks, hollow and light and barbed. A warning, written in ivory. There is no need to feel the weight of that silence too heavily. It is enough to know that it was deep, and that it stretched for miles in every direction, and that the people who lived at its edges had built their lives around it the way islanders build around the sea. They left offerings of clay at the boundary stones, small, clumsy figures of deer and goats, baked hard in village kilns and painted with ochre and charcoal. They did not expect the offerings to appease the beast. They expected them to be acknowledged. There was a difference. The boundary stones themselves were ancient, predating the empire that now claimed the plateau. No one remembered who had first set them in the red earth. But each generation added its own small markers. A flat stone laid against the base, a notch carved in the weathered surface, a new clay figure placed among the old ones. The stones formed a loose ring around the Manticore's territory, and the ring was respected. Caravans that knew the route gave the circle a wide berth, adding days to their journey. Those that did not know the route were never heard from again. The Manticore's favored lair was not a cave, but a hollow beneath a sandstone overhang, where the rock had fractured and fallen in some ancient tremor. The space was shallow, open to the sky on one side, but it held the shade through the worst of the afternoon heat. Here, the beast rested, its vivid red fur pressed against the cool stone, its pale human face turned toward the plain. Scattered around the hollow, half buried in red dust, lay several shed quills, translucent amber, still sharp, still waiting. Its days followed a rhythm older than the empire. At dawn, it drank from the waterhole, lowering its face with that strange, unsettling gentleness, the calm blue-gray eyes reflecting the pale sky. Then it sang, once, a long note that drifted across the plateau and faded into the rising heat. At dusk, it sang again, and the sound carried further in the cooling air, reaching the boundary stones and the villages beyond them. The locals timed their evening prayers to the distant music, offering thanks that it had not come closer. The clay offerings at the boundary stones were remade each season, the old figures worn down by wind and replaced with fresh ones. A mother teaching her daughter the shapes would explain nothing, only show the hands, the pressure of thumbs, the ochre mixed with water and applied in simple stripes. The girl learned to make a deer, a goat, a small kneeling figure with its arms outstretched. She did not ask what the figures were for. She already knew. Everyone knew. A quill, once shed, took nearly a full cycle of the moon to replace itself. Aelion described the process with a naturalist's care. A small pale nub, emerging from the follicle, soft as wet leather, then hardening over days into a translucent shaft. The barbs formed last, curling outward like the fronds of a fern. The beast was never without its armory for long, and the old quills, scattered across its territory, served as a permanent reminder that the weapon was not lost, but renewed. The plateau's ecology had bent around the Manticore's existence. With the large grazers driven south, the thorn scrub grew thicker in the empty zones, and the smaller creatures desert hares, lizards, the tiny mice that lived in the roots, multiplied in the absence of their usual predators. The beast did not hunt them. It waited for larger prey, and the waiting shaped the land. A natural order had reasserted itself, unfamiliar but stable, with a crimson sovereign at its still center. Travelers who passed the plateau's edge told stories of hearing the music without ever seeing its source. A merchant crossing the southern route at dawn might catch a single high note, clear as a reed pipe, and find that his camel had stopped walking, its ears flat and trembling. The note would fade, and the caravan would continue, and no one would speak of it for miles. Then someone would quietly suggest they make camp early, further from the red rocks, and no one would argue. There is no need to picture the silence too vividly. It is enough to know that it was deep, and that it had weight, and that the people who lived beside it had stopped thinking of it as silence at all. It was simply the sound the world made when the Manticore was near, a held breath, a listening. They did not hate the silence. They did not love it. They had woven it into the fabric of their days, and it no longer frightened them. It simply was. At night, when the moon rose over the plateau, the boundary stones stood like sentinels against the silver sky. The clay offerings at their bases caught the faint light, their ochre stripes pale and ghostly. Nothing disturbed them. The Manticore did not approach the stones, did not scatter the figures, did not acknowledge the boundary in any visible way, and yet the offerings remained exactly where they had been placed, season after season, as if the beast understood the ritual and chose, with the same quiet patience it brought to everything, to honor it. A shepherd, old and half-blind, once climbed a ridge on the northern edge of the territory and saw the Manticore resting in its hollow, its vivid red fur catching the last light, its pale human face turned toward the distant mountains. He watched for a long time, he later said, and the beast did not move. It knew he was there, he was certain. It simply did not care. He climbed down and never returned to that ridge, but he spoke of the moment with something like reverence, as if he had glimpsed not a monster, but a truth. This was the reign of the Manticore. No army of bones, no rivers of blood, no kingdom of ash, only a circle of silence on the red plateau, and a creature at its center that asked nothing of the world but its distance, and received it. The empire grew and fell, and grew again beyond the mountains, and the Manticore continued its quiet existence, patient and crimson and very far away. The reign was not a terror, it was a stillness, and stillness, of all things, is the hardest to disturb. But far to the south, in the villages along the Indus, plans were already forming that would do exactly that. Chapter 4. The Weight of the Stone. The hunter turned the stone over in his palm, feeling its weight, its coolness, the smooth, flat surface worn by centuries of river water. He had chosen it himself from the shallows of the Indus at dawn, a gray-green oval that fit his hand as if it had been shaped for this very purpose. He was not a warrior. He was a father, a husband, a man who knew the taste of red dust and the sound of his children laughing in the courtyard, and he was about to walk into the silence. The village behind him was waking slowly. Lamps flickered in the courtyards, and the smell of flatbread and warm milk drifted through the narrow lanes. Men gathered in the central square, checking bundles of rope and folded cloth, their voices low and unhurried. This was not the first hunting party the village had sent toward the Red Plateau, but it was the first in a generation, and the older men watched from their doorsteps with expressions that held no excitement, only memory. 3 elephants stood at the edge of the village, their great gray bodies dusted with red earth, their tusks capped in brass that caught the early light. The faded crimson cloth draped across their foreheads stirred in the warm breeze, and the wooden howdahs on their backs had been freshly bound with leather straps. Their handlers spoke to them in soft murmurs, pressing their hands against the rough hide, and the elephants stood perfectly still, as if they understood exactly what was being asked of them. There were no divine gifts laid out on the cloth before them. No oracle had spoken. No god had offered a shield or a spear. The hunters carried only what the land had given them: rope woven from river reeds, nets of knotted hemp, and the gray-green river stone that the lead hunter now slipped into a pouch at his belt. It was not a weapon in the way that a sword was a weapon. It was a tool, and its purpose was precise. It would break the stings of the cub, one by one. The old shepherd who had once climbed the northern ridge and seen the manticore resting in its hollow was dead now, but his story had become part of the village's knowledge, repeated by firelight until it had the weight of scripture. The hunters had listened as children and remembered as men. They knew the beast's territory, its habits, the sound its voice made at dawn and dusk. They knew they could not kill it. They did not intend to try. They intended to take its young in return, and that was a different kind of peril entirely. The lead hunter's name was not recorded by any Greek source. Elian, writing centuries later and thousands of miles away, called him simply one of the men of the Indus country, as if his identity mattered less than his action. But in the village that morning, as he checked the pouch at his belt and felt the weight of the river stone against his thigh, he was everything. His wife stood at the door of their home, holding their youngest child, and she did not wave. She simply watched, her face still, as he turned toward the elephants. There is no need to imagine that stillness too precisely. It is enough to know that it was deep, and that it was shared by every person who had ever watched a hunting party leave for the Red Plateau. The silence of the village was not despair. It was the sound of people who had lived beside a terror for so long that they had stopped calling it terror and started calling it distance. And distance could be crossed if you were careful, if you were quiet, if you carried the right stone. The elephants knelt, and the hunters climbed into the howdahs, settling themselves among the ropes and the folded nets. The handlers gave the command, and the great animals rose with a slow, rolling motion that lifted the men above the rooftops. The villagers stepped back, and the hunting party began to move first through the outer fields of millet and barley, then past the last well and the last mud brick wall, then out into the open country where the thorn scrub began and the green of the Indus faded into red. For a long time, no one spoke. The elephants walked steadily, their heavy feet raising small clouds of dust that hung in the still air before settling. The land changed around them by slow degrees, the ground hardening, the vegetation thinning, the color of the earth shifting from brown to ochre to the deep, dry red of the plateau. The sun climbed, and the heat pressed down, and the lead hunter kept one hand resting on the pouch that held the river stone. By midday, they had reached the first of the boundary stones, a weathered pillar of sandstone standing alone on a low ridge. The clay offerings at its base, tiny deer and goats painted with ochre, had been recently replaced, the figures still sharp and fresh. The elephants paused, and the hunters looked at the offerings, then at the red emptiness beyond. The circle of silence began. Here, no one said the word that hung in all their minds, but the lead hunter touched the stone at his belt once, lightly, as if greeting an old friend. The elephants crossed the boundary first, their great feet pressing deep into the red dust, and the silence of the plateau closed over them like water. The hunters felt it immediately. Not a sound, but a pressure, a low thrum of absence that seemed to press against their ears. The air was hotter here, drier, and the thorn scrub grew sparse and twisted. Even the flies had vanished. The lead hunter kept his hand on the pouch, and the river stone inside it felt heavier now, as if it understood where it was. A shed quill lay in the dust ahead, translucent and amber, half buried by the wind. The lead elephant stopped without being commanded, her trunk lifting to scent the air, and the hunters waited in the howdah, perfectly still. After a long moment, the elephant resumed her walk, stepping deliberately around the quill. The men did not need to speak. They had all seen the warning, and they had all chosen to continue. The quill passed beneath them and was left behind. The hollow was exactly where the old shepherd had said it would be, a shallow overhang of fractured sandstone on the western slope of a long ridge. The hunting party approached from the south, keeping the wind in their faces, the elephants moving with a silence that belied their size. And there, pressed against the cool stone in the deep shade of the overhang, was a shape the color of dried blood. Its pale human face turned away, its scorpion tail curled around its body. The adult manticore was resting, and for a long moment, no one breathed. Beside the adult, smaller and softer, its vivid red fur still downy with youth, lay the cub. It was perhaps a season old, its blue-gray eyes half closed, its 3 rows of teeth not yet fully grown, but already visible behind its lips. Its scorpion tail, still short, bore a fan of pale quills that had not yet hardened into weapons. It was sleeping, and its sleep was the most fragile thing on the plateau. The hunters looked at each other, and the plan that had been discussed for weeks now became a single, shared certainty. The elephants knew their role. On a silent signal from the handlers, they spread into a loose arc, their brass-capped tusks catching the sun, their faded crimson forehead cloths bright against the red stone. The adult manticore stirred, its calm blue-gray eyes opening, its pale human face turning toward the intruders. It did not roar. It did not charge. It rose slowly, a lion-sized beast, with vivid red fur and a scorpion tail bearing a curved sting and a fan of lateral quills, and it placed itself between the elephants and the cub. There is no need to measure the distance between them too carefully. It is enough to know that it was short and that neither side moved for a long, suspended moment. The adult manticore's quills were rising, fanning outward along its tail, but it did not launch them. The elephants stood their ground, their bulk a wall of living gray, their handlers murmuring low and steady. Between them, the cub awoke and lifted its head, and its small, unhardened quills glittered in the sun like threads of spun glass. The lead hunter descended from the howdah. His sandals touched the red dust, and the stone was in his hand now. Not the pouch, but his bare palm, his fingers curled around the gray-green oval. He walked toward the cub, while the elephants pressed forward, their sheer mass driving the adult back step by unwilling step. The mother's tail flicked once, a warning, and a single quill embedded itself in the hide of the nearest elephant, sinking deep into the thick gray flesh. The elephant shuddered, but did not retreat. The cub was trying to stand now, its small legs unsteady, its pale human face turned toward the approaching hunter. Its blue-gray eyes were not afraid. They were curious, still soft with sleep, still trusting the world that had not yet heard it. The hunter knelt in the red dust, and the stone in his hand was warm from his grip. He looked at the cub, and the cub looked at him. And somewhere behind them both, the adult manticore let out a sound that was not pipes and trumpets, but something older and rawer. His hands moved with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in the quiet of his own mind. He took the cub's tail gently, feeling the soft quills bend under his fingers, and he placed the first sting against the stone. One sharp, deliberate motion, and the quill snapped, its translucent amber shaft falling into the dust. The cub flinched, but did not struggle. The hunter worked quickly, breaking each sting in turn, the hollow quills piling at his knees like strange flowers. When it was done, he lifted the cub in his arms and carried it back to the elephants. The adult manticore watched from the ridge, its quills still raised, its blue-gray eyes unreadable, but it did not follow. The hunting party turned south, and the silence of the plateau closed behind them. The stone, still warm, was returned to the pouch, and somewhere in the red country, the first notes of the beast's music began to rise. Not a warning, not a lament, but a sound that would follow these men for the rest of their lives. Chapter 5. The Silence After the Stone. The stone cracked the quill with a sound that was not loud, but that the hunter felt in his teeth. He remembered it later as the moment the world split before and after, silence and music, the plateau and the long road home. The cub had not cried out. It had only looked at him with those calm blue-gray eyes, still soft with sleep, as if it understood something that he did not. Then the last sting fell into the dust, and the hunter stood, and the weight in his arms was suddenly heavier than stone. The elephants had not moved. Their great gray bodies stood like a wall between the hunter and the ridge where the adult manticore waited, its vivid red fur catching the descending sun, its pale human face unreadable. The quills along its tail had begun to lower, slowly, one by one, as if some internal decision had been reached. It did not advance. It did not call out. It simply watched. And the hunter felt the weight of that gaze pressing against his back as he turned toward the howdah. He climbed without speaking, the cub cradled against his chest, its downy red fur warm through the cotton of his garment. The other hunters received him with hands that guided but did not pull, their faces set in expressions that held no triumph. One of them took the broken stings from the dust, 7 pale amber shafts, still glinting, and wrapped them carefully in a square of cloth. They would be needed later, as proof. No one said the word proof aloud, but everyone understood. The handlers gave the command, and the elephants turned, their brass-capped tusks sweeping the air as they began the slow walk south. The howdah swayed with the familiar rhythm, and the hunter braced himself against its wooden frame, the cub still in his arms. Its tail, now blunt and harmless, curled instinctively around his wrist. He looked down at its pale human face, at the 3 rows of teeth just visible behind its lips, and he felt something that he had not expected and could not name. Behind them, the adult manticore began to sing. It was the same sound the old shepherd had described. Pipes and trumpets played together, high and clear and unbearably beautiful, drifting across the red plateau like a thread of gold. The hunter closed his eyes for a moment, and the music seemed to pass through him, vibrating in his ribs, settling somewhere deep. It was not a cry of grief, he realized. It was something older than grief. It was the sound of something continuing, despite everything. There is no need to imagine that sound too clearly. It is enough to know that it followed them, and that it was beautiful, and that it was the last thing any of them wanted to hear. The elephants walked on, their heavy feet pressing deep into the red dust, and the music faded by slow degrees, not stopping, but receding, as if the plateau itself was drawing it back into the stone. The hunters did not speak. They kept their eyes on the southern horizon, where the boundary stones waited. The cub slept. The hunter felt its breathing slow against his chest, its small body relaxing into the warmth of his arms, and he marveled at the trust of a creature that had, less than an hour before, been rendered harmless by his own hands. It did not know it was a prisoner. It did not know it was a gift. It only knew that it was tired, and that the arms holding it were warm, and that the world was still turning in the same direction it had always turned. That was enough. Dusk gathered in the thorn scrub as they crossed the invisible line that marked the edge of the manticore's territory. The boundary stone rose ahead, dark against the fading violet sky, its base still clustered with clay offerings. The lead elephant paused, and her handler dismounted to place a new figure among the old ones. A small elephant, crudely shaped but recognizable, painted with ochre and charcoal. It was not an offering of fear. It was an offering of thanks, and it was left facing outward, toward the red country, where the music had finally stopped. The hunter looked back once. The ridge was a dark silhouette against the last light, and on its crest, barely visible, a shape the color of dried blood stood motionless. The adult manticore had not moved from its position. It would not follow, he knew. It would return to its hollow, and the silence would reclaim the plateau, and the waterhole would remain undisturbed. The rain had not ended. It had simply been altered, a single thread pulled from a vast tapestry, the pattern shifting invisibly. Then the boundary stone passed behind them, and the ground began to soften, and the first scent of green things reached them on the cooling air. The hunter felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease, though only slightly, as if a hand that had been gripping him for hours had loosened its hold. The cub stirred in its sleep, its blunt tail twitching against his wrist, and he shifted his arms to hold it more securely. The road home had begun, and the weight in his chest was not relief. It was the first slow ache of a grief that would take years to understand. The night came quickly, as it always did on the plateau's edge, the temperature dropping with the sun. The hunters made camp in the lee of a low sandstone outcrop, the elephants kneeling in a protective circle around them. A small fire was lit, more for comfort than warmth, and the cub was placed on a folded cloth beside it. It awoke briefly, its blue-gray eyes reflecting the flames, and then slept again. The hunter sat watching it, the river stone still in its pouch, still warm. No one spoke of what they had done, because the words for it did not yet exist. The men ate flatbread and dried meat, and the handlers checked the elephant's wounds. The single quill that had embedded itself in the lead elephant's hide had been removed, the barb leaving a small, clean hole that was already clotting. The elephant stood perfectly still during the procedure, her dark eye fixed on the fire, and when it was done, she reached her trunk toward the sleeping cub and exhaled softly across its fur. The hunter slept in fragments, waking each time the cub stirred, each time the fire popped, each time the wind shifted and brought with it the faint, almost imagined echo of distant music. In his dreams, the sound was still there, pipes and trumpets, high and sweet, threading through the darkness like a needle through cloth. He woke to the gray light of false dawn and the realization that the music was not a dream. It was real, still, impossibly far away, but present, a single, sustained note that hung on the edge of hearing. By the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge, the note had vanished. The hunter rose and checked the cub, which blinked up at him with the calm, unfrightened gaze that he was beginning to recognize as its natural state. He offered it water from a clay cup, and it drank, its small, pale human face dipping toward the rim with the same strange gentleness its mother had shown at the waterhole. The hunter watched, and the grief he had felt the day before settled deeper, taking on the shape of something permanent. The journey south took 4 more days. Each morning, the land grew greener, the thorn scrub thickening into acacia and wild grass, the red dust giving way to brown earth. Small animals returned, hares, lizards, the first birds the hunters had seen since entering the plateau. The cub watched everything with quiet curiosity, its blunt tail twitching, its 3 rows of teeth hidden behind a small, peaceful mouth. The hunters had stopped seeing it as a prize or a danger. It was becoming something else, something none of them had a word for. At midday on the 5th day, the rooftops of the village appeared on the horizon, and the elephants quickened their pace without being asked. The cub, now riding in the hunter's lap rather than his arms, lifted its head and sniffed the air, catching the unfamiliar scents of cooking fires and livestock and river water. The hunter rested his hand on its head, feeling the soft, downy fur, and he understood that the creature in his care would never see the Red Plateau again. That knowledge was neither cruel nor kind. It was simply true. The village received them in silence. The women and children stood at the edges of the square, and the old men rose from their doorsteps, and no one cheered. The hunter dismounted from the howdah, the cub cradled against his chest, and his wife came forward to meet him. She looked at the cub, then at her husband's face, and she did not speak. She simply touched his arm, once, and then turned to lead him home. The fire in their courtyard was still burning. The cub was placed in a small enclosure built against the side of the house, a space that had once held goats, and now held straw and a clay bowl of water. It explored its new domain with careful steps, sniffing the walls, the straw, the water, its blunt tail swaying. The village children gathered at a respectful distance, watching through the gaps in the mud brick wall. and the cub looked back at them with its calm blue-gray eyes. Neither side knew what to make of the other. That night, the hunter sat beside the fire in his courtyard and finally removed the pouch from his belt. He took out the river stone, the gray-green basalt, still smooth, still cool, and held it in his palm. He had carried it across the plateau and back, and it had done exactly what he had asked of it. He did not know whether to keep it or throw it back into the Indus. In the end, he placed it on the low wall beside the enclosure, where it caught the firelight, and he left it there. It was not a trophy. It was a witness. The cub slept, and the village slept, and far to the north, the red plateau lay silent under the stars. The adult manticore would return to its hollow, and the waterhole would gather the morning dew, and the clay offerings at the boundary stones would be renewed by hands that had never seen the creature, but knew it was there. The circle of silence had not been broken. It had simply expanded, and somewhere at its new edge, a gift was already beginning its long journey westward. The rain had entered a new chapter, one that would carry the beast's name further than any quill could fly. Chapter 6. The Gift That Became a Ghost. The cub who had once been a terror became, in the space of a single season, something the village children called by a name that meant Little Red. They had no word for Manticore. That word belonged to the Greeks, to the physicians and the philosophers who would later argue over its teeth and its tail and its place in the order of things. The children only knew that the creature in the enclosure was small and soft and watched them with calm blue-gray eyes that held no hunger. They brought it scraps of flatbread, which it ate delicately from their palms. The hunter watched this from his doorway and felt something shift inside him. The cub was thriving, its downy fur thickening into the deeper crimson of adolescence, its blunt tail growing longer, but never regrowing its stings. The stone had done its work permanently. He had expected the creature to mourn, to pace, to call out for the mother it had lost. But the cub seemed to have accepted its new existence with the same quiet stillness its kind had always brought to everything. A patience that had no edge, only depth. The broken stings had been stored in a small wooden box lined with wool, each translucent amber shaft laid carefully beside the others. The hunter's wife had suggested wrapping them in silk, but there was no silk in the village, so she used a square of her own best cloth instead. The box sat on a shelf in the main room, and sometimes visitors asked to see it. The hunter always obliged, opening the lid and letting them look, but not touch. The stings were proof, yes, but they were also something else, a record of a moment that had divided his life. Word of the capture traveled faster than the cub ever would. Caravans passing through the village on their way to the Persian heartlands heard the story from the merchants in the square, and they carried it with them along the trade routes, embellishing as they went. By the time the tale reached the satrap's court in the next province, the manticore had become twice its real size, and its quills could pierce bronze shields. By the time it reached the royal city, the beast was a dragon with 1,000 stings. The cub in its enclosure knew nothing of this. It was still eating flatbread from the hands of children. The summons came in the form of a rider on a dust-colored horse, bearing a clay tablet stamped with the royal seal. The satrap had heard of the capture, and the King of Kings wished to see this creature for himself. The hunter stood in the square with the tablet in his hands, and the weight of it was heavier than the river stone had ever been. He had known, on some level, that this day would come. The cub was never meant to stay. It was a gift before it was anything else. A tribute, a curiosity, a fragment of the world's edge, delivered to the center of power. The morning of the departure, the hunter lifted the cub from its enclosure for the last time. It had grown heavier in the months since the plateau, its crimson fur thick and warm, its pale human face now level with his own when he held it. The calm blue-gray eyes looked into his, and he saw no accusation there, only the same patient stillness, the same quiet trust. He placed it in a larger cage, built for the journey, a construction of wood and leather straps, and the cub settled into it without struggle. That was the worst part. he thought later. It did not struggle. There is no need to imagine that departure too clearly. It is enough to know that the hunter stood at the edge of the village and watched the caravan disappear into the dust, and that he did not move for a long time after it had gone. His wife came to stand beside him, and she did not speak, and the silence between them was the same silence that had followed them back from the plateau. The river stone was still on the wall where he had left it. He had not touched it since the night he had placed it there, and he did not touch it now. But he looked at it for a long time. The journey to the Persian court took months. The cub traveled in a train of merchants and soldiers, its cage draped with cloth to shield it from the worst of the sun. It was fed well. The king's orders had been specific, and it grew leaner, but not weaker. Its vivid red fur dulled slightly by dust, but still striking. The soldiers who guarded it spoke to it in low voices, and some of them, against all reason, grew fond of it. It never made a sound. It simply watched the road unspooled behind them with those calm blue-gray eyes, as if measuring the distance between itself and everything it had ever known. Ctesias, the Greek physician, was still at court when the caravan arrived. He had grown older in the years since he had first pressed the word martichora into wax, and his dark, curled hair was now streaked with gray, his deep blue chiton worn soft with age. He heard the commotion in the outer courtyards, the shouts of soldiers, the trumpeting of an elephant, the murmur of gathered nobles, and he went to see what had arrived. And there, in a wooden cage, stained with the dust of a dozen provinces, was the creature he had written about years before, now breathing, now real, now looking directly at him. He approached the cage slowly, his wax tablet forgotten in his hand. The cub, though it was no longer quite a cub, its shoulders broadening, its pale human face sharper, turned its head and regarded him with an expression that was neither hostile nor fearful. Its 3 rows of teeth were visible behind slightly parted lips, but its mouth was relaxed. Its tail, blunt and harmless, curled around its haunches. Ctesias stood very still, and for a long moment, the physician and the beast simply looked at each other, and the crowd around them faded into silence. The word had become flesh. The presentation took place in the great hall of the palace, beneath glazed brick panels of turquoise and ochre that gleamed in the light of 100 oil lamps. Artaxerxes II, bearded and wearing a gold and purple canvas robe, with a tall, upright tiara, seated on a low throne of dark wood, received the gift with the stillness that kings are taught from birth. The cub was brought forward in its cage, and the court fell silent. The king studied it for a long moment, his eyes moving from the crimson fur to the pale human face, to the blunt, harmless tail. Then he nodded once. The beast belonged to the empire now. Ctesias watched from the side of the hall, his wax tablet pressed against his chest, and felt the strange vertigo of a man who has written about something unseen and then been confronted with its living reality. He had described the manticore's face, its teeth, its tail, its voice, but the voice was the one thing the cub never used. It made no sound in the great hall, not a cry, not a murmur, not the faintest echo of the pipes and trumpets its mother sang across the red plateau. Ctesias wondered if the stings in the voice were connected somehow, if breaking one had silenced the other. He had no way to know. No one did. The cub was given a courtyard of its own, a walled garden, with a small pool and a date palm, and a patch of grass that struggled in the dry heat. It lived there for the remainder of its days, fed on goat meat and fresh water, attended by servants who had been instructed not to fear it. Its crimson fur grew duller with age, its pale human face settling into lines that might have been weariness or wisdom, or both. The children of the court were sometimes brought to see it, and it received them with the same patient stillness it had always possessed. It never tried to escape. There was nowhere to escape to. Years passed. The hunter in the Indus village grew older, his dark braided hair turning gray, his children marrying and having children of their own. The river stone still rested on the wall of his courtyard, and sometimes his grandchildren asked him about it, and he told them the story of the elephants, the plateau, the cub, the sound of pipes and trumpets that followed them all the way to the boundary stones. He did not embellish. The truth was enough, and when his grandchildren asked what had happened to the cub, he told them it had gone to the king. That was all he knew. That was all anyone knew. Ctesias, too, grew old. He left Persia eventually and returned to Cnidus, carrying with him the completed manuscript of his Indica, in which the Manticore occupied a prominent place among the wonders of the East. He had seen the beast with his own eyes, and his written account carried the weight of that witness. The broken stings, which had been kept in the royal treasury, were brought out for him to examine one last time before his departure. He held one in his hand, translucent amber, hollow, lighter than he had expected, and then returned it to its box. The proof was sufficient. The story would outlast them all. The cub died in its courtyard in the 12th year of its captivity. The servants found it in the morning, lying beneath a date palm, its blue-gray eyes closed, its pale human face peaceful. There was no mark upon it, no sign of illness. It had simply stopped living, as if the stillness it had always carried had finally deepened into something permanent. The king ordered it buried with honor, and a small tomb was built in the palace gardens, its location recorded and then forgotten. The courtyard was empty again, and the servants swept the fallen leaves from the stones and did not speak of what had lived there. The mother, far to the east, had never been seen again. The villagers who tended the boundary stones reported that the offerings were still taken, not scattered or destroyed, but simply gone, as if something had accepted them in the night and left no trace. The waterhole remained undisturbed, and the silence of the plateau endured. No new cub was ever reported. No second Manticore emerged from the Red Country. The hunters did not return to the hollow beneath the sandstone overhang, but the old shepherd's grandson, climbing the same ridge years later, saw a shape the color of dried blood still resting there, still watching the plain. He did not climb that ridge again. There is no need to measure the grief too precisely. It is enough to know that it was there in the hunter's silence, in Ctesias's careful handwriting, in the empty courtyard where the date palm dropped its fruit on stones that no living creature walked. The Manticore's bloodline was not a lineage of cubs and mothers and territories passed down through generations. It was a lineage of memory, carried in a wooden box of broken stings and a physician's wax tablet, and the story a grandfather told his grandchildren beside a courtyard fire. That was the true aftermath. That was what remained. Elian, writing 2 centuries later, would add the final detail that bound the story together. The hunters who captured the Manticore cub, he noted, used a stone to break its stings. He did not describe the stone. He did not know its color, or its shape, or the river it had come from. But the hunter knew, and his children knew, and the stone itself knew, resting on its wall year after year, growing warm in the sun and cool in the night, holding its silence like a promise. Some witnesses do not speak. They simply remain. The manuscript of Ctesias was copied and recopied, and the word martichora spread westward through the libraries of the Mediterranean world. Aristotle read it, Pliny summarized it, Pausanias doubted it, and in every generation that followed, someone new opened a scroll and found the beast waiting there, crimson, patient, with calm blue-gray eyes, and a tail that could still, in the reader's imagination, launch its quills across any distance. The cub had died in a Persian courtyard, and the mother had faded into the red plateau, and the hunter's stone had worn smooth with age. But the story was only beginning. Chapter 7. The Edge of Every Map. The lamp had burned low in Pausanias' study, and the scroll of Ctesias lay open across his knees, its edges worn soft by the hands of previous readers. He had been traveling for years through the lands the Greeks called the East, measuring the old stories against the stones and the rivers and the witness of living people. He had found no Manticore. He had found no quills, No bones. No frightened villagers leaving clay offerings at boundary stones. What he had found was a tiger, a great striped cat that hunted in the tall grass. And that, seen from a distance, might be anything. It was fear that made the tiger into a monster, he wrote. Fear and distance, the twin engines of every myth. A man walking alone through the red country sees a shape in the heat shimmer, and his mind, already strained by thirst and solitude, assembles the shape into something worse than it is. The tiger's stripes become quills. Its roar, distorted by the wind, becomes the sound of pipes and trumpets. The human face, that most haunting of details, is simply the mind projecting itself onto the unknown. The monster is a mirror. Pausanias was not wrong, exactly. The tiger did exist in the Indus country, and its ferocity was real. And travelers who wandered into its territory did not always return. But his explanation, reasonable as it was, missed something essential. The Manticore was never just a tiger exaggerated by fear. It was a map, a record of the precise point where the known world ended and the unknown began. The tiger could be explained, catalogued, hunted. The Manticore could not, because it lived in the one place no hunter could reach. The distance between what a traveler knew and what he could never be certain of. The word itself carried that distance. Martichora, from the old Persian marsha kavara, man-eater. A warning encoded in syllables, a boundary drawn in language. The Persians who first named it did not need to describe its face, or its tail, or its voice. The name was enough. It told the traveler everything he needed to know. Beyond this point, the world does not belong to you. The Greeks, with their passion for taxonomy, translated that warning into anatomy, giving the Manticore a body so that they could believe they understood it. But the name was always the truer thing. The medieval bestiaries, those strange and beautiful catalogues of the world's imagined creatures, received the Manticore from the Greek texts and transformed it further. The illustrators, working by candlelight in scriptoria far from any desert, added wings, great bat-like pinions that the ancient sources never described. They placed a crown upon its human head, or a bishop's mitre, turning the beast into an allegory of pride or heresy, or the seduction of worldly power. The Manticore became a moral lesson, and its red fur, once the color of the Gedrosian plateau, became the color of hellfire. The wings were a fiction, and the crown was a fiction, and the moral lesson was a fiction laid upon a fiction. But the illustrators were not wrong either. Not entirely. They were doing what every generation had done with the Manticore, using it to map the boundaries of their own understanding. The beast that had once marked the edge of the geographical world now marked the edge of the moral world. The unknown had shifted from the landscape to the soul, and the Manticore had shifted with it, patient as always, adapting to the new territory. There is no need to understand every transformation the Manticore underwent across the centuries. It is enough to know that it was never fixed, never stable, never content to remain the creature Ctesias had described. Each era gave it new teeth, new meanings, new reasons to exist. It appeared in the margins of maps and the footnotes of encyclopedias and the nightmares of travelers who had read too widely and slept too little. It was a shape that refused to settle, and that refusal, that perpetual becoming, was the deepest truth about it. The Gedrosian plateau, when the first modern explorers reached it, was exactly as the ancient sources had described: red sandstone, thorn scrub, dry wadis, and a silence that seemed to press against the ears. They found no Manticore, but they found the boundary stones, or what remained of them, their carved symbols worn almost smooth by centuries of wind. At the base of one, half buried in the red dust, a small clay figure of a deer still faced outward toward the emptiness. It had been placed there by hands that had no writing, no history, no name that survived. But the offering remained. Satellite imagery now maps every mile of that plateau. There are no blank spaces on the modern cartographer's screen. No regions marked with dragons or man-eaters, or the words, "Here be monsters." The distance that created the Manticore has been measured, photographed, reduced to data. And yet the silence remains. The red earth has not changed color. The wind still moves through the thorn scrub with a sound like dry bones shifting. The waterhole still holds water, and something still drinks from it in the hour before dawn. The map has been filled in, but the emptiness has not been erased. The tiger, Pausanias's sensible explanation, is now endangered in the very region where the Manticore once prowled. Its stripes, which the old naturalists believed had been mistaken for quills, are vanishing from the world even as the quills themselves, the real, physical, broken stings that Ctesias held in his hand, have crumbled to dust in some lost Persian archive. The taiga may survive in reserves and breeding programs, carefully managed, meticulously documented. The Manticore needs no such protection. It has never been vulnerable to anything but certainty, and certainty has always been in short supply. The truth, then, is not a single thing, but a layering. The tiger is true. The quills are true. Ctesias held them. Aelion described them. The hunter broke them with a stone. The human face may be an exaggeration, or it may not be. Nature has produced stranger convergences than a beast that wears a human mask. The voice is the hardest to dismiss, because sound carries across empty landscapes in ways that distort and transform, and every traveler who crossed the plateau heard something in the wind that they could not explain. The layers do not cancel each other. They accumulate. What the Manticore represented to its originating culture was not a moral failing, or a divine punishment, or a test of heroic virtue. It was simply the edge. Every civilization draws a line between the world it controls and the world that controls itself, and the space beyond that line must be populated with something. The Persians, looking east toward India, populated it with a man-eater. The Greeks, looking further east, populated it with the same creature, now given a body and a voice and a place in their natural histories. The line moved, but the creature remained. The historian contemplates this and feels something shift beneath the weight of the texts. The Manticore was not a lie that people told each other for entertainment. It was a truth of a different order, a truth about the limits of knowledge, the fragility of travelers, the way the human mind fills emptiness with forms it can recognize and fear. The monster was not the beast on the Red Plateau. The monster was the plateau itself, the vast unmeasured space where anything could be true because nothing could be verified. The Manticore was simply the name given to that vertigo. And here, at the end of the story, a quiet question settles over the lamplit room where all these scrolls have been read. What monsters do we still keep at the edges of our own maps? The age of geographical discovery has ended, but the age of certainty has not begun. There are still distances we have not crossed. Distances of knowledge, of understanding, of empathy, and in those distances, shapes still move. We have given them different names, different anatomies, different moral weights, but they are still red. They are still patient. They're still waiting. The Manticore survived because it was never only one thing. It was a Persian warning, a Greek puzzle, a Roman footnote, a medieval allegory, an Enlightenment joke, a romantic symbol, a modern curiosity. It shape-shifted through centuries, the way it was once said to dissolve into red stone, becoming whatever each era needed it to be. And if you listen closely to the stories we tell now, the terrors that haunt our own cultural imagination, you may still hear, beneath the noise, the high, sweet sound of pipes and trumpets drifting across an empty plain. The boundary stones are still there. Archaeologists have found them weathered pillars of sandstone, arranged in a loose ring on the Gedrosian plateau. Their carvings too eroded to read, their bases surrounded by fragments of clay figurines. They are catalogued now, photographed, assigned reference numbers in university databases. No one leaves offerings at them anymore. But the ring is still a ring, and the center of the circle is still empty, and the wind that moves through the thorn scrub still carries the same sound it carried when Ctesias first pressed his stylus into wax. There is no need to imagine that sound too clearly. It is enough to know that it is there, and that it has always been there, and that it will be there long after the last copy of Ctesias has crumbled, and the last digital archive has failed, and the last story about the Manticore has been told. The silence of the plateau is not a silence at all. It is a music played at a frequency that human ears cannot hold for long. A note sustained across millennia, carrying the memory of crimson fur and calm blue-gray eyes, and a tale that could launch its quills across any distance. The hunter's stone, if it survives, rests in some unmarked grave, or on some forgotten wall, or at the bottom of the Indus, worn smooth beyond recognition. The cub's bones, buried with honor in a Persian garden, have long since returned to the earth. The manuscript of Ctesias survives only in fragments, quoted by later authors, its original text lost in the fires that consumed so much of the ancient world. And the mother, far to the east, has become indistinguishable from the red rock where she once rested, her legend outliving her body by a factor of centuries that shows no sign of ending. This is the legacy. Not a monster, not a warning, not a lesson. A presence, a shape in the corner of the eye that vanishes when you turn to look directly at it. A sound that you hear only when you stop trying to hear it. The Manticore was never a creature of flesh and blood alone. It was a creature of distance, and distance cannot be killed with a stone, or captured in a cage, or buried in a garden. Distance can only be crossed, and even then, it is not destroyed. It is simply moved, pushed further out, waiting to be populated again. So the path carries you back now, out of the Red Country and into the world you left behind when this story began. The map is still in your hands, and its edges are still frayed. And somewhere beyond the last line of text, a shape the color of dried blood lies resting on a sandstone shelf, its pale face turned toward the horizon, its tail curled around its body. It is not waiting for you. It is not waiting for anyone. But it is there, and it will be there, and the music it makes will drift across the empty plains for as long as there are distances we have not yet crossed. The word has been written. The shadow remains, and the silence, if you listen now, sounds exactly like pipes and trumpets played together.